A pregnant woman is in a life or death crisis. She urgently needs a heart transplant, but time is running out, and no donor is available. The situation grows desperate, until Henry, a homeless man with nothing to lose, steps forward. In a world that has given him nothing, he now holds the power to offer the greatest gift of all: a chance for both mother and child to live. The emergency room was a storm of noise and movement. Doctors and nurses rushed from one patient to another, their faces etched with concentration and fatigue. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of beeping machines. In the middle of it all, Martina lay on a gurney, her face pale and her breathing shallow. She was 7 months pregnant, and her heart was failing. Tom, her husband, stood by her side, clutching her hand. His eyes were red from crying, and his voice trembled as he spoke to the doctors. "Please, you have to save her. Save them both." Dr. Patel, the lead cardiologist, looked at Tom with a heavy heart. "We're doing everything we can, but her heart is too weak. Without a transplant, we might lose both her and the baby." Tom felt like the ground was slipping from under him. "There has to be something you can do. Anything." Dr. Patel hesitated before speaking. "We need a donor. Someone with a compatible heart, but finding one in time, it's unlikely." Tom's mind raced. He felt helpless, desperate. He looked at Martina, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with effort. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't lose their baby. Outside the hospital, the cold night air bit at Henry's skin. He pulled his tattered coat tighter around him and shuffled down the street. His face was weathered, his beard unkempt, but his eyes held a quiet strength. He had been on the streets for years, but he had never lost his sense of humanity. As he passed the hospital, he heard a sound that made him stop. It was a man's voice, filled with anguish. Henry turned and saw Tom, standing outside the emergency room doors, his face in his hands, sobbing. Henry hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Tom looked up, startled. He saw a homeless man standing before him, but there was something in the man's eyes that made him pause. "No," Tom said, his voice breaking. "My wife. She's dying. And our baby. They need a heart transplant, but there's no donor." Henry listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Tom finished, Henry looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "If I die, can they save them?" Tom stared at him, stunned. "What?" Henry repeated himself, his voice steady. "If I die, can they save your wife and baby?" Tom's mind reeled. He didn't know what to say. I don't know. Maybe, but why would you?" Henry shrugged. "I don't have much. No family, no home. But I got a good heart. If it can save them, then maybe my life ain't been for nothing." Tom felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell Henry that he couldn't do this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Henry gave him a small smile. "Don't thank me yet. Let's see if it works." Inside the hospital, the doctors were shocked when Tom explained what had happened. Dr. Patel looked at Henry with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Henry nodded. "I'm sure. Just make sure they live." The paperwork was signed, and Henry was prepped for surgery. As he lay on the operating table, he looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Maybe I never had a chance, but that baby does." The surgery was long and complicated. The doctors worked tirelessly, knowing that 2 lives depended on their skill. Finally, after hours of intense effort, they stepped back, exhausted but hopeful. Martina's new heart was strong, and her baby was still safe inside her. Tom waited by her side, his heart pounding with fear and hope. When she finally opened her eyes, he felt a surge of relief. "Martina," he said, his voice trembling. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." She looked at him, confused. "What happened?" Tom took a deep breath. "You needed a new heart, and someone gave it to you." Martina's eyes filled with tears. "Who?" Tom hesitated, then said, "His name was Henry. He was a homeless man. He gave his heart so you and the baby could live." Martina's hand went to her chest, where Henry's heart now beat. She felt a wave of emotion, a mix of gratitude and sorrow. I don't know what to say. Tom took her hand. He said he didn't have much, but he wanted to give you and the baby a chance. He said not to let his life be in vain. Martina closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. I won't, she whispered, I promise. As the days passed, Martina grew stronger. The baby was healthy, and the doctors were optimistic. Tom stayed by her side, never leaving her for a moment. But he couldn't stop thinking about Henry, the man who had given them everything. One day, as Martina slept, Tom went to the hospital chapel. He sat in the quiet room, his head in his hands. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you, Henry. I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, as if Henry's spirit was there with him, reassuring him that everything would be okay. When Martina was finally discharged from the hospital, she and Tom stood outside, taking in the fresh air. Martina looked down at her belly, where their baby was growing strong. We're going to name him Henry, she said suddenly. Tom looked at her, surprised. Henry? Martina nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Yes, after the man who gave us everything. Our son will carry his name, and we'll make sure he knows the story of the man who saved his life. Tom smiled, his heart swelling with love for his wife and their unborn child. Henry, he said softly, it's perfect. As they walked away from the hospital, they passed a small plaque on the wall. It was new, and the words were simple but powerful. Henry gave his heart so 2 lives could keep beating. Martina and Tom stopped and read the plaque, their hearts filled with gratitude. They knew that Henry's sacrifice would never be forgotten, and that his legacy would live on in their son. The days that followed Henry's sacrifice were a blur for Martina and Tom. Martina's recovery was slow but steady, and the baby continued to grow strong inside her. Every time she felt the baby kick, she was reminded of the miracle that had saved them both. She often placed her hand over her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of Henry's heart beating within her. It was a constant reminder of the man who had given them everything. Tom, on the other hand, struggled with the weight of what had happened. He couldn't shake the image of Henry's face, the quiet determination in his eyes as he offered his heart. He felt a deep sense of guilt, wondering if there had been another way, if they could have saved Henry too. But every time he looked at Martina, at the life growing inside her, he knew that Henry's sacrifice had been worth it. One evening, as they sat together in their small apartment, Martina broke the silence. Tom, we need to talk about Henry. Tom looked up, surprised. What about him? Martina took a deep breath. I've been thinking. We don't know anything about him. Who he was, where he came from, why he was on the streets. I feel like we owe it to him to find out, to honor his memory. Tom nodded slowly. You're right. We do owe him that. But where do we even start? Martina thought for a moment. The hospital might have some information. Maybe they know more about him. The next day, they returned to the hospital. Dr. Patel was surprised to see them but welcomed them warmly. Martina, Tom, it's good to see you. How are you feeling? Martina smiled. We're doing well, thanks to you, and to Henry. Dr. Patel's expression softened. Henry was a remarkable man. His selflessness saved 2 lives. I've never seen anything like it. Tom hesitated before speaking. Dr. Patel, we were wondering, do you know anything more about Henry? Who he was? Where he came from? We want to honor his memory, but we don't even know his full story. Dr. Patel sighed. I'm afraid we don't have much information. He didn't have any identification, and he didn't talk much about his past. But there was something he said before the surgery. He mentioned that he had once had a family, but he lost them. He didn't go into details, but it seemed like he had been through a lot. Martina's heart ached at the thought. He lost his family. That's so sad. Dr. Patel nodded. Yes, it is. But in the end, he found a way to give life to another family. That's something to be proud of. As they left the hospital, Martina and Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. They decided to do whatever they could to learn more about Henry and to honor his memory. Their first step was to visit the streets where Henry had lived. They walked through the cold, bustling city, asking anyone they met if they had known Henry. Most people shook their heads, but finally, they found an old man who recognized Henry's description. "Yeah, I knew Henry," the man said, his voice rough but kind. "He was a good guy. Always helped out when he could, even though he didn't have much himself." Martina's eyes lit up. "Do you know anything about his past? Where he came from?" The old man shook his head. "Not much, he didn't talk about it much, but I know he had a hard life. Lost his wife and kid a long time ago. After that, he just kind of drifted." Tom felt a lump in his throat. "That's terrible." The old man nodded. "Yeah, it was. But Henry never let it break him. He always had a kind word for anyone who needed it. He was a good man." Martina and Tom thanked the old man and continued their search. They visited shelters, soup kitchens, and anywhere else they thought Henry might have been. Slowly, they began to piece together a picture of the man who had saved their lives. They learned that Henry had been a carpenter before he lost his family. He had been a hard-working man, devoted to his wife and young daughter. But after their deaths, he had fallen into a deep depression and eventually lost everything. He had been on the streets for years, but he had never lost his kindness or his willingness to help others. As they gathered more information, Martina and Tom decided to create a memorial for Henry. They wanted to ensure that his story would be remembered, that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. They worked tirelessly, gathering photos, stories, and memories from the people who had known Henry. They created a small exhibit in a local community center, showcasing Henry's life and his final act of selflessness. The opening of the exhibit was a quiet but emotional event. Martina and Tom stood before the small crowd, their hearts heavy but full of gratitude. "Henry was a man who had lost everything," Martina said, her voice trembling. "But even in his darkest moments, he found a way to give life to others. He gave us the greatest gift anyone could ever give. He gave us a future." Tom stepped forward, holding Martina's hand. "We will never forget Henry. His heart beats within Martina, and his spirit lives on in our child. We will make sure that his story is told, that his sacrifice is remembered. Because Henry wasn't just a homeless man, he was a hero." The crowd was silent, moved by their words. As they walked through the exhibit, reading about Henry's life and seeing the photos of the man who had saved Martina and her baby, they felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude. Martina and Tom knew that their journey was far from over. They still had so much to learn about Henry, so much to do to honor his memory. But they also knew that they were not alone. Henry's legacy would live on, not just in their family, but in the hearts of everyone who heard his story. As they left the community center that night, Martina placed her hand over her chest, feeling the steady beat of Henry's heart. She looked at Tom and smiled. "We're going to be okay," she said, "because of him." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "Yeah," he whispered, "because of him." The weeks turned into months, and Martina's pregnancy progressed smoothly. The baby grew stronger with each passing day, and Martina and Tom found themselves growing more and more excited to meet their child. But even as they prepared for the arrival of their son, they never forgot Henry. His presence was a constant in their lives. A quiet reminder of the sacrifice that had made their future possible. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery they had prepared, Martina looked at Tom with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Henry would have liked the name we chose?" Tom smiled softly. "Henry? Of course he would. It's perfect." Martina nodded, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I just wish he could have known. I wish he could have seen our baby, seen how much good he did." Tom reached out and took her hand. "He knows, Martina. Somehow, I think he knows." As the due date approached, Martina and Tom decided to visit Henry's memorial one last time before the baby arrived. They stood before the plaque at the hospital, reading the words that had been etched there in Henry's honor. "Henry gave his heart so 2 lives could keep beating." Martina placed her hand over her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of Henry's heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." Tom wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We'll never forget you, Henry. We'll make sure our son knows your story." The day finally came when Martina went into labor. Tom rushed her to the hospital, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The doctors and nurses were ready, and within hours, Martina gave birth to a healthy baby boy. As they held their son for the first time, Martina and Tom felt a wave of emotion unlike anything they had ever experienced. The baby was perfect, with tiny fingers and toes, and a strong, steady heartbeat. "Henry," Martina whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Our little Henry." Tom looked down at his son, his heart swelling with love. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice choked with emotion, just like his namesake. The days that followed were a whirlwind of joy and exhaustion. Martina and Tom spent every moment they could with their newborn son, marveling at the miracle of his life. But even in their happiness, they never forgot the man who had made it all possible. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, Martina looked at Tom with a determined expression. "We need to do something more for Henry," she said. "Something that will ensure his legacy lives on." Tom nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing, but what can we do?" Martina thought for a moment, then smiled. "We can start a foundation in his name. A foundation to help people like Henry, people who have fallen on hard times but still have so much to give." Tom's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. We can provide support, resources, maybe even scholarships for people who want to turn their lives around." Martina nodded. "Exactly. We can help them find hope, just like Henry gave us hope." Over the next few months, Martina and Tom worked tirelessly to establish the Henry Foundation. They reached out to local organizations, gathered donations, and spread the word about their mission. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life were moved by Henry's story and wanted to help. The foundation's first event was a small but heartfelt gathering. Martina and Tom stood before the crowd, their son Henry in their arms, and shared their story. "Henry was a man who had lost everything," Martina said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But even in his darkest moments, he found a way to give life to others. He gave us the greatest gift anyone could ever give. He gave us a future." Tom stepped forward, holding their son. "We will never forget Henry. His heart beats within Martina, and his spirit lives on in our child. We will make sure that his story is told, that his sacrifice is remembered. Because Henry wasn't just a homeless man. He was a hero." The crowd was silent, moved by their words. As they walked through the exhibit, reading about Henry's life and seeing the photos of the man who had saved Martina and her baby, they felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude. Martina and Tom knew that their journey was far from over. They still had so much to learn about Henry, so much to do to honor his memory. But they also knew that they were not alone. Henry's legacy would live on, not just in their family, but in the hearts of everyone who heard his story. As they left the community center that night, Martina placed her hand over her chest, feeling the steady beat of Henry's heart. She looked at Tom and smiled. "We're going to be okay," she said, "because of him." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "Yeah," he whispered, "because of him." The Henry Foundation grew steadily, becoming a beacon of hope for those in need. Martina and Tom poured their hearts into the organization, ensuring that Henry's legacy of selflessness and compassion continued to touch lives. But even as they worked to help others, they couldn't shake the weight of Henry's sacrifice. It was a constant presence in their lives, a reminder of the incredible gift they had been given. One afternoon, as Martina sat in the foundation's office, she received a phone call that would change everything. It was Dr. Patel, the cardiologist who had performed Henry's transplant. "Martina, I need to speak with you and Tom," Dr. Patel said, his voice serious. "It's about Henry." Martina's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," Dr. Patel reassured her. "But there's something you need to know. Can you and Tom come to the hospital?" Martina agreed, her mind racing with questions. She called Tom, and they arranged to meet at the hospital later that day. When they arrived, Dr. Patel led them to a quiet room and handed them a folder. "We've been going through Henry's records," he explained, "and we found something you should see." Martina opened the folder, her hands trembling. Inside were documents detailing Henry's medical history, along with a handwritten letter. She recognized Henry's handwriting immediately. "What is this?" Tom asked, his voice filled with concern. Dr. Patel took a deep breath. "Henry left this letter for you. He wrote it before the surgery. He asked us to give it to you when the time was right." Martina's eyes filled with tears as she unfolded the letter. She began to read aloud, her voice shaking. "Dear Martina and Tom, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're both okay. That's all I ever wanted. I don't have much to say, but I want you to know why I did what I did. I lost my family a long time ago. My wife, Sarah, and my daughter, Emily, were my whole world. When they died, I felt like I had nothing left to live for. I wandered for years, trying to find some kind of purpose. But nothing ever felt right. Then I met you, Tom, outside the hospital. I saw the pain in your eyes, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't save my own family, but maybe I could save yours. Maybe this was the purpose I had been searching for all along. Please don't feel guilty about what happened. This was my choice, and I'm at peace with it. Take care of each other, and take care of your baby. Live the life I couldn't have. That's all I ask. With love, Henry." Martina's voice broke as she finished reading the letter. Tears streamed down her face, and Tom pulled her into a tight embrace. They sat in silence for a long time, holding each other and processing Henry's words. Finally, Tom spoke. "He wanted this," he said quietly. "He wanted to give us a chance." Martina nodded, wiping her tears. "He did. And we can't let his sacrifice be in vain. We have to live the life he wanted for us." Dr. Patel watched them with a somber expression. "Henry was a remarkable man," he said. "His decision to give his heart was one of the most selfless acts I've ever seen. But it's also a reminder of how fragile life is. You have a second chance, Martina. A chance to live, to love, and to raise your son. Don't waste it." Martina and Tom left the hospital that day with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that Henry's letter was a gift, a final message from the man who had saved their lives. They vowed to honor his memory by living fully and by continuing the work of the Henry Foundation. But as the days passed, Martina began to feel a growing sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Henry's story, more that they didn't know. She decided to dig deeper, to try to uncover the full truth about the man who had given them everything. Her search led her to a small town a few hours away, where Henry had once lived. She and Tom packed up their car and set out on the journey, their son Henry sleeping peacefully in the backseat. When they arrived, they began asking around, showing people a photo of Henry. At first, no one recognized him, but finally, an elderly woman at a local diner paused and studied the photo closely. "That's Henry," she said, her voice soft with recognition. "Henry Carter. He used to live here, years ago. He was a good man. A carpenter. Had a wife and a little girl." Martina's heart raced. "Do you know what happened to them?" The woman's expression darkened. "It was a tragedy. There was a fire. Henry's wife and daughter didn't make it. He was never the same after that. He left town soon after. We never saw him again." Martina felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. As they left the diner, Tom took Martina's hand. "We're getting closer," he said. "We're starting to understand who he was." Martina nodded, but she couldn't shake the sadness she felt. Henry had lost everything, and yet he had still found a way to give. She knew they had to honor his memory, not just by helping others, but by ensuring that his story was never forgotten. Martina and Tom spent the next few days in the small town, piecing together Henry's past. They visited the local library, where they found old newspaper articles about the fire that had taken Henry's family. The headlines were stark and heartbreaking. "Tragic house fire claims lives of local mother and daughter." The article detailed how Henry had tried to save them but had been unable to reach them in time. It was a story of unimaginable loss, and it explained so much about the man Henry had become. They also visited the cemetery, where Henry's wife and daughter were buried. The graves were simple, marked by 2 small headstones. Martina knelt beside them, her heart heavy with emotion. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I wish I could have known you. But I promise, we'll take care of Henry's memory. We'll make sure he's never forgotten." Tom placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes filled with tears. He loved them so much, he said quietly, and he lost them. But even after all that, he still found a way to give. That's incredible. As they stood there, a soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees nearby. It felt almost as if Henry's spirit was with them, acknowledging their presence and their promise. When they returned home, Martina and Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew they had to do more than just run the Henry Foundation. They had to ensure that Henry's story reached as many people as possible. They decided to write a book about his life, detailing his struggles, his loss, and his ultimate act of selflessness. The process of writing the book was emotional and challenging. Martina often found herself crying as she typed out the words, imagining the pain Henry must have felt. But she also felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that his sacrifice had given her and Tom a future they might not have had otherwise. One evening, as they worked on the book together, Tom looked at Martina with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Henry would have wanted this, for us to share his story with the world?" Martina nodded without hesitation. "Yes. He gave us everything, Tom. The least we can do is make sure people know who he was. Not just as the man who saved us, but as the man who loved his family, who suffered unimaginable loss, and who still found a way to give." Tom smiled softly. "You're right. This is how we honor him." The book, titled Henry's Heart, A Story of Loss, Love, and Legacy, was published a year later. It quickly gained attention, touching the hearts of readers around the world. People were moved by Henry's story, and many reached out to Martina and Tom to share how it had inspired them. The Henry Foundation also grew exponentially, thanks to the attention brought by the book. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their programs and help even more people in need. Martina and Tom felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that they were continuing Henry's legacy in a meaningful way. But even as they celebrated their successes, they never forgot the man who had made it all possible. Every year, on the anniversary of Henry's death, they visited the hospital where his plaque hung. They brought their son, Henry, now a curious and energetic toddler, and told him the story of the man he was named after. "This is Henry," Martina would say, pointing to the plaque. "He was a very brave man. He gave us his heart so that we could live, so that you could be here with us." Little Henry would listen intently, his wide eyes filled with wonder. Though he was too young to fully understand, Martina and Tom knew that one day he would. They were determined to raise him with the same kindness and compassion that Henry had shown the world. Years passed, and the Henry Foundation became a cornerstone of hope in the community. Martina and Tom worked tirelessly, ensuring that Henry's legacy lived on through their efforts. Their son, Henry, grew into a bright and compassionate child, always curious about the man he was named after. Martina and Tom made sure to tell him stories of Henry's kindness, his sacrifice, and the love he had for his family. One evening, as the family sat together for dinner, little Henry looked up at his parents with a serious expression. "Mom, Dad, can we visit Henry's grave? I want to see where he's buried." Martina and Tom exchanged a glance. They had never taken their son to the cemetery where Henry's wife and daughter were buried, but they realized it was time. "Of course," Martina said softly. "We'll go this weekend." That Saturday, they made the trip to the small town where Henry had once lived. The cemetery was quiet, the air filled with the sound of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. They walked to the graves of Henry's wife and daughter, their footsteps slow and reverent. Little Henry stood between his parents, his small hand clutching Martina's. He looked at the headstones, his brow furrowed in thought. "This is where Henry's family is?" he asked. "Yes," Tom replied, his voice gentle. "This is where they rest. Henry loved them very much." Little Henry knelt down, placing a small bouquet of flowers he had picked on the graves. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting Henry save my mom and me." Martina's eyes filled with tears, and she knelt beside her son, wrapping an arm around him. "That's a beautiful thing to say, Henry. I'm sure they're proud of you." As they stood there, a sense of peace settled over them. It felt as though Henry's spirit was with them. watching over them and smiling at the family he had helped create. When they returned home, Martina and Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that Henry's story was far from over. It lived on in their son, in the work of the foundation, and in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by his sacrifice. One day, Martina received a letter from a woman who had read Henry's heart. The woman explained that she had been inspired by Henry's story to become an organ donor. She had recently donated a kidney to a stranger, saving their life. She thanked Martina and Tom for sharing Henry's story, saying it had given her the courage to make a difference. Martina read the letter aloud to Tom, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is what it's all about," she said. "Henry's legacy is changing lives, even now." Tom nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "He would be so proud of what we've done, of what you've done." Martina smiled, placing a hand over her chest, where Henry's heart still beat strong. "We've done it together, Tom, and we'll keep doing it, for as long as we live." As the years went on, the Henry Foundation continued to grow, helping countless people in need. Martina and Tom became advocates for organ donation, sharing Henry's story at events and conferences. Their son, Henry, grew up to be a kind and compassionate young man, determined to make a difference in the world, just like the man he was named after, on the day of his high school graduation. Little Henry, now a young man, stood before his classmates and delivered a speech that moved everyone to tears. "My name is Henry," he began, "and I was named after a man I never met, but who has always been a part of my life. He was a man who lost everything but still found a way to give. He gave his heart so that my mom and I could live. His sacrifice taught me that even in the darkest moments, we can find light. We can choose to help others, to make a difference." That's the legacy he left behind, and it's the legacy I hope to carry forward. The audience erupted into applause, and Martina and Tom felt a surge of pride and emotion. They knew that Henry's story would continue to inspire others for generations to come. As they left the graduation ceremony, Martina took Tom's hand and smiled. "We did it," she said. "We kept our promise to Henry." Tom nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "Yeah," he whispered, "we did." Years turned into decades, and the legacy of Henry Carter continued to ripple through the lives of countless people. The Henry Foundation had become a global organization, funding medical research, supporting organ donation initiatives, and providing resources for those in need. Martina and Tom, now in their 60s, had stepped back from the day-to-day operations, but their passion for the Foundation's mission never wavered. Their son, Henry, had taken on a leadership role, ensuring that his namesake's story remained at the heart of everything they did. One crisp autumn morning, Martina sat in the sunlit living room of their home, flipping through an old photo album. The pages were filled with memories, pictures of her and Tom, their son Henry as a child, and the countless events they had hosted for the Foundation. But her eyes lingered on a particular photo. A grainy image of Henry Carter, the man who had given them everything. It was the only photo they had of him, taken from an old newspaper article about the fire that had claimed his family. Tom walked into the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He handed one to Martina and sat beside her, glancing at the photo album. "Remembering the old days?" he asked with a smile. Martina nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of the photo. "It's hard to believe how much time has passed. Sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday that we were in that hospital, waiting to see if I'd make it." Tom wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We've come a long way since then, and it's all because of him." Martina sighed, leaning into Tom's embrace. "I just wish he could see what his sacrifice has done. How many lives he's touched." Tom kissed the top of her head. "He knows, Martina. I'm sure of it." Later that day, their son Henry stopped by for a visit. Now in his 30s, he had grown into a man who embodied the kindness and selflessness of the Henry he was named after. He had dedicated his life to the Foundation, working tirelessly to expand its reach and impact. "Mom, Dad," he said as he walked into the house, "I have some news. We've been invited to speak at a global organ donation summit in Geneva. They want us to share Henry's story as the keynote address." Martina's eyes lit up. "That's incredible. It's such a huge platform. We could reach so many people. Tom nodded in agreement. It's a great opportunity, but it's also a big responsibility. We need to make sure we do Henry's story justice. Henry smiled. I've already started working on the speech. I want to talk about not just his sacrifice, but also his life. Who he was, what he lost, and why he made the choice he did. I think it's important for people to understand the full picture. Martina reached out and took her son's hand. You're going to do an amazing job, Henry. Your namesake would be so proud of you. The weeks leading up to the summit were a whirlwind of preparation. Martina, Tom, and Henry worked together to craft a speech that would honor Henry's memory while inspiring others to consider organ donation. They gathered photos, stories, and testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the Foundation's work. When the day of the summit finally arrived, the family stood backstage, their nerves palpable. The auditorium was filled with hundreds of people from around the world, doctors, researchers, policymakers, and advocates, all gathered to discuss the future of organ donation. Henry took a deep breath and turned to his parents. This is it, he said. Are you ready? Martina smiled, her eyes filled with pride. We're ready. As they walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. Henry stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding but his voice steady. Good morning, he began. My name is Henry, and I'm here today to tell you the story of another Henry. A man I never met, but who has shaped every aspect of my life. He went on to share Henry Carter's story, from his life as a devoted husband and father to the tragedy that shattered his world. He spoke of Henry's selfless decision to give his heart to save Martina and her unborn child, and how that act of kindness had sparked a movement that had touched countless lives. Henry Carter was a man who had lost everything, Henry said, his voice filled with emotion. But even in his darkest moments, he found a way to give. He gave his heart so that two lives could keep beating. And in doing so, he gave us all a reminder of the power of compassion, of the difference one person can make. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. When Henry finished his speech, the room erupted into a standing ovation. Martina and Tom stood beside him, their hearts swelling with pride. As they left the stage, Martina turned to her son and smiled. You did it, Henry. You told his story perfectly. Henry nodded, his eyes shining with tears. I just hope it makes a difference. Tom placed a hand on his son's shoulder. It already has. The impact of Henry's speech at the Global Organ Donation Summit was immediate and profound. News outlets around the world picked up the story, sharing Henry Carter's legacy with millions of people. Social media was flooded with posts about the man who gave his heart, and the Henry Foundation saw an unprecedented surge in donations and volunteer sign-ups. More importantly, organ donor registrations skyrocketed in the weeks following the summit, as people were inspired by Henry's selflessness. Martina, Tom, and their son Henry returned home feeling a deep sense of accomplishment, but they knew their work was far from over. The foundation's success meant they could expand their programs even further, but it also brought new challenges. They needed to ensure that the momentum from the summit didn't fade, that Henry's story continued to inspire action. One evening, as the family sat together in their living room, Martina brought up an idea she had been thinking about. What if we created a memorial for Henry? Something permanent, where people can go to learn about his story and reflect on the importance of organ donation. Tom nodded thoughtfully. That's a great idea, but where would we put it? Henry didn't have a gravesite, and the hospital plaque is nice, but it's not enough. Henry leaned forward, his eyes lighting up. What about a garden? A place where people can come to sit, reflect, and learn about Henry's story. We could include a statue or a plaque with his name and a summary of what he did. Martina's face broke into a smile. A garden. That's perfect. A place of peace and remembrance. We could even include a section where people can leave notes or stories about how organ donation has touched their lives. The idea quickly took shape, and the family began planning the Henry Carter Memorial Garden. They chose a location near the hospital where Henry's heart had been transplanted, a place that held deep significance for them. They worked with architects, landscapers, and artists to design a space that would honor Henry's memory while providing a tranquil environment for visitors. The centerpiece of the garden was a bronze statue of Henry, depicted as he had been in life, a humble man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. At the base of the statue was a plaque with his name and the words, "Henry Carter, a man who gave his heart so that others might live." Surrounding the statue were benches, flowering plants, and a small fountain, creating a serene atmosphere. The garden also included a wall of hope, where visitors could leave notes sharing their own stories of organ donation. Some wrote about loved ones they had lost, while others shared how receiving an organ had given them a second chance at life. The wall quickly became a powerful testament to the impact of Henry's sacrifice. On the day of the garden's grand opening, Martina, Tom, and Henry stood before a crowd of supporters, donors, and community members. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the space. Martina stepped up to the microphone, her voice filled with emotion. "This garden is more than just a memorial. It's a place of hope, of remembrance, and of gratitude. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we can choose to give, to help others, to make a difference. Henry Carter showed us that, and we are forever grateful." Tom followed, his voice steady but heartfelt. "Henry didn't have much in life, but he had a heart full of love and compassion. He gave that heart to us, and in doing so, he gave us a future. This garden is our way of saying thank you, not just to Henry, but to all the donors and their families who have made sacrifices like his." Finally, Henry stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd. "My namesake, Henry Carter, was a hero, but he was also a man who loved, who lost, and who found a way to give even when he had nothing left. This garden is a tribute to his life and to the countless others who have followed in his footsteps. May it inspire us all to live with kindness, courage, and generosity." As the ceremony concluded, visitors began to explore the garden, many stopping to leave notes on the wall of hope. Martina, Tom, and Henry watched from a distance, their hearts full. "He would have loved this," Martina said softly, her hand resting over her chest, where Henry's heart still beat strong. Tom nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "Yeah, he would have." Henry smiled, looking at the statue of his namesake. "His legacy will live on here, and in all of us." The Henry Carter Memorial Garden quickly became a beloved landmark in the community. People from all walks of life visited to reflect, find solace, and learn about the man whose story had touched so many. Schools began organizing field trips to the garden, teaching children about the importance of organ donation and the power of selflessness. The wall of hope grew steadily, filled with heartfelt messages from people whose lives had been changed by organ donation. For Martina, Tom, and their son Henry, the garden was a place of peace and connection. They often visited together, sitting on one of the benches and watching as visitors paused to read the plaque or leave a note. It was a tangible reminder of the impact Henry Carter had made, not just on their lives, but on the world. Years passed, and the family continued their work with the Henry Foundation, though they gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations. Their son Henry had taken on a larger role, ensuring that the foundation's mission remained strong. He had also started a family of his own, naming his first daughter Sarah, after Henry Carter's late wife. The cycle of honoring Henry's legacy continued, weaving his story into the fabric of their lives. One crisp autumn morning, Martina and Tom visited the garden alone. The leaves had turned golden, and the air was filled with the scent of fallen foliage. They sat together on their favorite bench, holding hands and watching as a young couple paused to read the plaque. "Do you ever wonder what Henry would think of all this?" Martina asked, her voice soft. Tom smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I think he'd be amazed. And proud. He never wanted recognition, but I think he'd be glad to know that his story has inspired so many people." Martina nodded, her gaze drifting to the statue of Henry. "I still feel him sometimes, you know. When I place my hand over my heart, it's like he's there, reminding me to keep going, to keep making a difference." Tom squeezed her hand. "He is there, Martina. In you, in our son, in this garden. His heart never stopped beating. It just beats in a different way now." They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the garden, the rustling leaves, the gentle trickle of the fountain, filling the air. It was a moment of quiet gratitude, a reminder of how far they had come and the man who had made it all possible. As the years went on, the garden became a symbol of hope and resilience, not just for the community, but for the world. People traveled from far and wide to visit, to leave a note on the wall of hope, or simply to sit and reflect. Henry Carter's story was shared in books, documentaries, and even a feature film, ensuring that his legacy would never be forgotten. Martina and Tom grew older, but their passion for the foundation never wavered. They spent their days surrounded by family, their grandchildren running through the garden and playing by the fountain. It was a life filled with love, purpose, and gratitude. A life made possible by Henry's sacrifice. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Martina and Tom sat together on their bench, watching as their grandchildren played nearby. Martina placed her hand over her chest, feeling the steady beat of Henry's heart. "Do you think he knows?" she asked softly. "Do you think he knows how much he's changed the world?" Tom smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "I think he does, and I think he's proud of us, of everything we've done to honor his memory." Martina nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "We've done our best, haven't we?" "We have," Tom replied, "and we'll keep doing it, for as long as we live." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the garden, Martina and Tom sat together, their hands intertwined. The sound of laughter filled the air, a reminder of the life they had built. A life made possible by the man who had given his heart so that they might live. Henry Carter's legacy was more than a story. It was a heartbeat, a rhythm that echoed through the lives of everyone he had touched. And as long as that heartbeat continued, his spirit would live on, a testament to the power of love, sacrifice, and the enduring strength of the human heart.
If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from. It helps this channel grow more than you know. Have a nice day.